Consumer culture defines modern existence. The act of purchasing goods, whether provisions, apparel, or the countless commodities enabled by digital commerce, represents a fundamental component of contemporary life. The mechanics of this exchange appear remarkably uniform across market economies worldwide. You enter a store, select your items, complete your transaction. Simple, efficient, universal. But what if shopping wasn't simple at all? Welcome to the Soviet Union, where the act of shopping looked nothing like what we know today. Operating under fundamentally different economic principles, the USSR developed an entirely distinct approach to retail distribution, one that would become a laboratory for centralized planning, a battleground for Cold War legitimacy, and ultimately, a system whose failures contributed substantially to the Soviet Union's dissolution. What characterized the daily reality of acquiring goods under a command economy? Which merchandise actually reached consumers, and through what institutional frameworks? Did material scarcity genuinely afflict Soviet citizens? Or was this narrative merely Western ideological construction? The answers reveal far more than simple economic comparisons might suggest. Understanding the Soviet shopping experience requires examining not merely what appeared on store shelves, but the philosophical foundations and practical mechanisms that determined how an entire civilization organized the most basic human activity, acquiring the necessities of life. Today, we re-stepping behind the Iron Curtain to explore a world where the simple act of buying bread became an odyssey. If you want to explore more untold stories from the Cold War, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We're uncovering the hidden realities that shaped this era, one documentary at a time. Join us, and let's keep diving into history together. The Soviet approach to consumer goods distribution emerged from ideological commitments forged during the Bolshevik Revolution. In November 1917, when Lenin's forces seized control, private commerce represented more than mere economic activity. It embodied the class exploitation that Marxist-Leninist theory demanded be eliminated. The nationalization of industry, formalized through a series of decrees between 1917 and 1918, extended logically to retail operations. By 1921, however, the theoretical purity of war communism had produced catastrophic results. Industrial production had collapsed to approximately 20% of pre-war levels. Faced with peasant rebellions and urban starvation, Lenin implemented the new economic policy, temporarily permitting limited private trade. This pragmatic retreat lasted until 1928, when Stalin's consolidation of power enabled a return to comprehensive state control. The first five-year plan, initiated in 1928, prioritized heavy industry almost exclusively. Steel production, machine tools, electrical generation, these sectors received overwhelming investment allocation. Consumer goods manufacturing occupied a tertiary position in planning calculations. The rationale followed Stalin as industrialization doctrine. The Soviet Union required military-industrial capacity to survive in a hostile capitalist encirclement. Citizens would necessarily sacrifice immediate material comfort for long-term collective security. This hierarchical resource allocation established patterns that persisted throughout Soviet history. Even during periods of relative prosperity, the system's structural logic ensured that consumer goods production remained subordinate to industrial and military priorities. The consequences manifested directly in retail environments. The institutional framework for Soviet retail crystallized during the 1930s. Gosplan, the state planning committee established in 1921, but greatly expanded under Stalin, determined production quotas for every manufactured item. These quotas translated into directives issued to state enterprises, which operated as monopolistic producers within their designated sectors. The Ministry of Trade, restructured repeatedly but consistently present, managed distribution networks connecting factories to retail outlets. This command economy architecture eliminated market mechanisms entirely. Prices reflected not supply and demand interactions, but centralized calculations intended to balance consumption with production capacity while maintaining political stability. Subsidies kept basic necessities affordable. Luxury goods carried inflated prices to absorb excess purchasing power and signal social distinctions. By 1940, the Soviet retail landscape had assumed characteristics that would define it for decades. State stores operated under standardized protocols. Private commerce had been virtually eliminated, surviving only in marginal gray market activities. A system functioned according to planning documents, not consumer preferences. These foundational elements would shape the shopping experience for generations of Soviet citizens. Understanding where Soviet citizens acquired goods requires examining a hierarchical retail system characterized by stark geographic and institutional variations. At the apex existed the Central Universal Department Stores, known universally by the Russian acronym TSUM. These establishments represented the Soviet answer to Western department stores, though operating under fundamentally different principles. The Moscow TSUM, established in 1922 through nationalization of the pre-revolutionary Mur and Mireles department store, occupied a prominent position in the Tverskoy district on what was then Sverdlov Square, subsequently renamed Teatralnaya Square. The building itself symbolized continuity with pre-Soviet commercial architecture, though its operation reflected entirely new economic relationships. Additional TSUM stores appeared in republic capitals throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Kiev in 1927, Leningrad in 1928, Minsk in 1933. These premier retail establishments carried merchandise perceived as superior in quality, though corresponding prices exceeded those in ordinary stores. The differential reflected not merely quality gradations, but the system's method of managing consumer demand. By concentrating higher quality goods in limited outlets at elevated prices, planners attempted to prevent excessive purchasing power from creating inflationary pressures, while rewarding party loyalty and professional achievement. Nevertheless, TSUM stores remained accessible only to urban populations in major cities. For the vast majority of Soviet citizens, the state universal department stores, GUM provided the primary large-scale retail option. The Moscow GUM, opened in 1893 and nationalized in 1921, with operations resuming in 1923, became the archetypal example. Its location on Red Square, directly opposite the Kremlin, invested the store with symbolic significance beyond its commercial function. GUM stores proliferated throughout Soviet cities during the 1930s, though construction accelerated particularly after 1945. These establishments resembled Western shopping arcades, featuring multiple specialized departments under one roof. The Leningrad GUM, the Kiev GUM, the Tbilisi GUM, each republic capital and major city developed its own version. By 1960, estimates suggest approximately 180 GUM stores operated across the Soviet Union, serving perhaps 40 million regular customers. The shopping process within these stores, however, diverged dramatically from Western retail practices. The notorious 3Q system emerged as a defining characteristic of Soviet commerce. This procedure required consumers to first identify desired merchandise and confirm its price with a sales clerk. Subsequently, shoppers proceeded to a separate cashier station to render payment and obtain a receipt. Finally, a third queue formed before a different sales clerk who verified the receipt and dispensed the purchased item. This cumbersome protocol served multiple functions within Soviet institutional logic. It created employment positions, absorbing labor in an economy committed to full employment regardless of efficiency considerations. It established bureaucratic controls intended to minimize theft and unauthorized price adjustments. It generated documentation trails, enabling planners to track consumption patterns. The system's inefficiency from a consumer perspective reflected efficiency from a planning and control perspective. Reform attempts emerged periodically. In 1970, Leningrad witnessed the opening of the first Universum stores, self-service supermarkets modeled explicitly on American retail practices that Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had observed during his 1959 United States visit. These establishments permitted customers to select merchandise independently, pay at a single checkout counter, and exit, a revolutionary simplification in the Soviet context. The Universum concept expanded throughout the 1970s, reaching Moscow in 1971 and extending to other major cities by the decade's end. By 1980, approximately 500 Universum stores operated across the USSR. Yet these modern retail environments remained concentrated in large urban centers. Citizens in smaller cities and rural areas continued relying on traditional formats. Beyond these larger establishments, a network of specialized shops served daily needs. Producti stores sold basic groceries. Moloko shops specialized in dairy products. Miaso outlets handled meat distribution. Chleb stores provided bread and baked goods. Odizda shops carried clothing. Mebel stores sold furniture. This specialization reflected planning categories. Each store type corresponded to a different production ministry and planning department. Geographic disparities in retail access generated substantial inequality. Moscow and Leningrad enjoyed privileged positions, receiving priority allocation of manufactured goods. Republic capitals followed in the distribution hierarchy. Provincial cities occupied tertiary positions. Rural areas faced severe limitations, often depending on periodic market days and traveling salespeople for access to anything beyond absolute necessities. This hierarchical distribution system encoded political priorities directly into retail geography. Party members, government officials, military officers, and favored professionals accessed special closed stores, the Biozinka shops accepting only foreign currency, the closed distributors serving the nomenklatura. These exclusive outlets stocked imported goods and premium Soviet products unavailable elsewhere, creating a parallel retail system accessible only to the politically connected. The duality between official state stores and this shadow network of privileged retail establishments revealed fundamental contradictions within Soviet ideology. A system ostensibly eliminating class distinctions had created new hierarchies, with access to consumer goods functioning as a primary marker of social position. The chronic scarcity of consumer goods represented not an aberration within the Soviet system, but an inherent consequence of its structural logic. Understanding this requires examining the command economy's operation at multiple levels. Central planning's fundamental challenge lay in information aggregation and processing. Gosplan officials, working from Moscow, attempted to determine production quantities for hundreds of thousands of distinct products. These calculations required forecasting consumer demand without market price signals, coordinating inputs across thousands of enterprises, and adjusting for transportation constraints and regional variations. The computational complexity exceeded available administrative capacity. The planning process operated on 5-year cycles, with annual adjustments and quarterly refinements. Yet consumer preferences shifted continuously. A plan formulated in 1975 for 1980 production targets necessarily relied on 1973 to 1974 data. By the time goods reached stores in 1980, consumer desires had evolved. The lag generated persistent mismatches between what factories produced and what citizens wanted. Moreover, the planning system's incentive structure encouraged output quantity over quality or variety. Factory managers received bonuses and career advancement based on meeting production quotas measured in physical units or total value. A shoe factory assigned to produce 100,000 pairs of shoes faced no penalty for manufacturing 100,000 identical pairs, though consumer demand encompassed numerous sizes, styles, and quality levels. Fulfilling the plan became an end in itself, divorced from actual utility. The resulting shelves exhibited simultaneously too much and too little. Warehouses overflowed with unwanted goods, single-size shoes, unfashionable clothing, obsolete electronics, while shops chronically lacked basics. In 1982, Soviet statisticians estimated that approximately 30% of retail floor space held merchandise, for which essentially no demand existed, while shortages affected roughly 40% of consumer goods categories. Specific examples illustrate the systemic dysfunction. During the early 1980s, toilet paper shortages affected numerous Soviet cities. The shortage resulted not from insufficient paper production. The USSR produced enormous quantities of newsprint, but from planning failures that allocated paper to newspapers, while underestimating bathroom tissue demand. Similarly, the famous shortage of quality women's undergarments stemmed from planners treating textile production as an undifferentiated category, failing to account for style preferences and size distributions. Footwear presented particularly acute problems. Soviet factories produced hundreds of millions of pairs annually, yet finding shoes that fit remained notoriously difficult. The planning system specified production by total pairs, creating incentives to manufacture the smallest viable sizes that still counted as complete units. Additionally, leather allocation prioritized military boots, leaving civilian shoe production dependent on synthetic materials of frequently poor quality. The shortage economy generated elaborate coping strategies. Soviet citizens developed sophisticated skills in navigating retail scarcity. The concept of blatant formal networks of reciprocal favors and connections became essential. Knowing a sales clerk in a particular store, maintaining relationships with warehouse workers, cultivating friendships with factory employees, these connections enabled access to goods before they reached store shelves or when they arrived without public announcement. Queuing evolved into a social institution. When desirable merchandise appeared, lines formed immediately. Citizens joined queues without even knowing what was being sold, assuming that any queue indicated something worth obtaining. The phrase "standing in line" entered Russian as a verb stoyat v очереди, carrying connotations far beyond mere waiting. It represented a survival skill, a time investment, a form of labor. The practice of storing goods emerged logically from supply unpredictability. When soap appeared, prudent shoppers purchased multiple bars, uncertain when the next shipment would arrive. When light bulbs became available, households stocked dozens. This hoarding behavior, entirely rational at individual levels, exacerbated systemic shortages by accelerating depletion of available inventory. Black market activities proliferated despite official prohibition and legal penalties. Speculators fartsovshchiki purchased goods in one location and resold them at markup in areas experiencing shortages. The practice violated Soviet law, classified as speculation and punishable by imprisonment. Yet informal markets flourished, particularly in Moscow and Leningrad, where travelers from provincial areas brought money to purchase items unavailable back home. The system's defenders argued that shortages reflected transitional difficulties, growing pains in an economy progressing toward communist abundance. Soviet economists published statistics demonstrating rising production volumes, increasing retail turnover, expanding store networks. These figures, while not entirely fabricated, concealed qualitative deficiencies. A society might produce sufficient shoes numerically, while still leaving citizens barefoot due to poor quality, improper sizing, or distribution failures. Western analysts debated interpretations. Some emphasized shortages as evidence of socialism's inherent inefficiency. Others noted that Soviet citizens, while frustrated by consumer goods scarcity, generally enjoyed guaranteed employment, subsidized housing, free healthcare, and free education, a different social contract prioritizing security over consumption. The debate reflected broader ideological conflicts. with each side selecting evidence supporting predetermined conclusions. Nevertheless, by the 1980s, consumer goods availability had become a political vulnerability. Soviet citizens increasingly encountered foreign media, whether through smuggled magazines, Radio Free Europe broadcasts, or limited sanctioned exchanges. The contrast between Western supermarket abundance and Soviet retail scarcity became impossible to ignore. Mikhail Gorbachev's acknowledgement that the consumer sector required fundamental reform signaled recognition that the shortage economy undermined the system as legitimacy. The August 1991 attempted coup against Gorbachev illustrated the problem's political dimensions. Among the plotters' stated justifications was the collapsing consumer economy, empty shelves, inflation, disintegrating distribution networks. Yet the coup's failure and the subsequent Soviet dissolution demonstrated that no amount of centralized control could resurrect the command economy's credibility. The system that had defeated Nazi Germany and launched Sputnik could not provide consistent access to basic consumer goods. The abstract mechanisms of central planning translated into concrete daily experiences that shaped Soviet social relationships and cultural attitudes. Understanding the shopping experience requires examining how ordinary citizens navigated these systemic constraints. A typical shopping expedition for a Moscow family in 1975 might proceed as follows. The morning began with the household member designated for shopping, often women, though gender roles showed more flexibility than in contemporary Western societies, checking neighborhood stores for new deliveries. The Produkte shop on the corner had bread and milk, both subsidized staples reliably available. The Miasso store's display case showed only bones and gristle, indicating another week without quality meat. The shopper proceeded to the larger Gome, arriving at 9 a.m. as doors opened. The first task involved surveying departments to identify what merchandise had appeared overnight. The shoe department held only children's sizes. The fabric section offered gray wool and little else. But the household goods department displayed aluminum pots, a relative luxury. The shopper joined the growing queue, eventually reaching the clerk at 10:15. After confirming the price 45 rubles, approximately a week's wages for an average worker, she proceeded to the cashier queue, emerging at 10:45 with the receipt. The final queue concluded at 11:20, 2 hours and 20 minutes, invested in purchasing a single pot. Meanwhile, word had spread through informal networks that the Moloko shop 3 streets away had received fresh butter. By the time our shopper arrived at noon, the line stretched around the block. She joined, waiting 2 additional hours before learning that supplies had exhausted just 10 customers ahead. The butter would not reappear for perhaps 2 weeks. This scenario, repeated with variations across millions of households, consumed enormous time and energy. Economists studying the Soviet system estimated that average citizens spent perhaps 20 to 25 hours weekly on shopping-related activities, substantially more than their Western counterparts. This time, burden effectively reduced living standards beyond what nominal wages and prices suggested. The psychological effects extended beyond mere inconvenience. The unpredictability of supply generated constant low-level anxiety. What if the family needed winter coats before winter coats appeared in stores? What if a child's shoes wore out between the spring and fall shipments? The inability to plan purchases fostered stress that permeated daily existence. Yet the system also generated unexpected social cohesion. Lines became venues for conversation, information exchange, and community formation. Shoppers discussed not merely merchandise, but politics, culture, and daily life. The shared experience of navigating shortages created solidarity, a collective sense of enduring absurdity together. Soviet humor, the anecdote tradition, frequently targeted shopping frustrations, transforming systemic dysfunction into cultural commentary. The concept of hunting for goods entered Soviet vocabulary as a metaphor. Citizens spoke of catching deficit items, tracking deliveries, capturing scarce merchandise. This linguistic pattern revealed how thoroughly scarcity had reshaped daily consciousness. Shopping evolved from a mundane task into an endeavor requiring strategy, persistence, and skill. Children learned these skills early. Parents taught offspring to recognize quality, to identify real leather versus imitation, to spot defective manufacturing before purchase. These lessons formed part of practical education, survival training for the Soviet economy. A child who could effectively evaluate merchandise and navigate queuing protocols contributed meaningfully to household welfare. The system's inefficiencies created opportunities for informal economic activity beyond simple black market trade. Services emerged to exploit the time cost of shopping. Individuals would stand in queues professionally, holding places for others willing to pay. Touts outside major stores offered information about current inventory for small fees. These activities, while technically illegal, proliferated with tacit official acceptance. Geographic mobility introduced additional complications. Travel between Soviet cities required internal passports and often explicit authorization. Yet citizens regularly traveled specifically for shopping. Leningraders journeyed to Moscow. Muscovites traveled to Leningrad. Both groups made expeditions to Soviet republics, rumored to have better supplies of specific goods. These shopping trips represented significant undertakings, requiring days away from work and considerable expense. The closed cities classified urban areas with restricted access due to military or scientific installations presented unique cases. Cities like Arzamas 16 or Chelyabinsk 70, homes to nuclear weapons research, enjoyed privileged supply positions. Residents accessed consumer goods unavailable elsewhere, though they sacrificed freedom of movement. This trade-off material comfort for geographic restriction illustrated the system's fundamental hierarchies. Foreign currency stores, Berioska shops, existed entirely outside the ordinary retail system. These outlets accepted only hard currency, dollars, pounds, Deutschmarks. They stocked imported goods and premium Soviet products, theoretically available only to foreigners and Soviet citizens with legitimate foreign currency earnings. In practice, these stores serviced the black market. Currency speculation, illegal but widespread, enabled those with connections to access Berioska inventory. The parallel existence of ordinary state stores and privileged special stores created visible inequality that contradicted official egalitarian ideology. A party official could walk past queuing citizens and enter a closed distributor, stocked with goods the queuing citizens would never see. This hypocrisy, the gap between communist principles and socialist practice, eroded systemic legitimacy more effectively than any Western propaganda. By the 1980s, the shortage economy had generated a population simultaneously adapted to deprivation and increasingly resentful of it. Soviet citizens had developed remarkable skills in obtaining necessities through informal networks and persistence. Yet they had also become acutely aware, through expanding media access and limited travel opportunities, that Western consumers enjoyed vastly superior retail experiences without equivalent effort. This awareness contributed substantially to the political transformations of the late 1980s. When Gorbachev initiated glasnost and perestroika, the subsequent debates about economic reform resonated powerfully precisely because every Soviet citizen possessed first-hand experience with the consumer sector's failures. The shopping experience, mundane, daily, universal, became a referendum on the entire Soviet system. The Soviet shopping system's terminal crisis arrived during the late 1980s. Gorbachev's reforms, intended to revitalize the command economy, instead accelerated its disintegration. The introduction of limited market mechanisms without dismantling planning structures created chaos rather than improvement. In 1987, the law on state enterprises granted factories greater autonomy in production decisions. Managers, liberated from rigid plan fulfillment requirements, promptly shifted output toward more profitable items. Consumer goods production, already inadequate, declined further as factories pursued easier profits elsewhere. By 1989, shortages had intensified dramatically. The situation deteriorated catastrophically in 1990 to 1991. Store shelves emptied nationwide. Rationing systems, absent since the 1940s, reappeared in numerous cities. Moscow introduced ration cards for basics including sugar, butter, vodka, and tobacco in January 1991. By summer, the Soviet Union's retail system had effectively ceased functioning. The August 1991 coup attempt collapsed partly because military units, promised improved conditions, including better consumer goods access, found these promises implausible. 3 months later, the Soviet Union dissolved. The command economy that had persisted for 7 decades vanished within months. The transition to market economics proved traumatic. Prices liberalized in January 1992, triggering hyperinflation. State stores privatized rapidly, often corruptly. The queues disappeared, but so did affordability. New private shops stocked imported goods, but at prices exceeding typical monthly salaries. The wild capitalism of the 1990s generated nostalgia for Soviet-era stability, despite the queues and shortages. A generation later, Russian retail has converged with global norms. Modern supermarkets, international chains, online shopping all function as they do throughout developed economies. Yet the Soviet shopping experience remains culturally resonant. Russians who experience the queues carry distinctive attitudes toward consumption, savings, and scarcity. The hoarding instinct persists. The Blatt networks have translated into post-Soviet business relationships. Economically, the Soviet experiment provides cautionary lessons about central planning's limitations. The inability to process consumption information, the misaligned incentives, the absence of competition, these structural flaws prove insurmountable. No amount of administrative refinement could overcome the command economy's fundamental information problem. Politically, the shopping experience demonstrated that regimes cannot indefinitely postpone consumer satisfaction for putative future abundance. The Soviet social contract security and equality in exchange for material deprivation functioned, while citizens lacked comparison points. Once alternatives became visible through mass media and limited travel, the contract's legitimacy evaporated. The Soviet shopping system's legacy extends beyond Russia. China's economic reforms since 1978 explicitly addressed consumption failures that had plagued the Soviet model. Vietnam's Doi Moi reforms similarly prioritized consumer goods availability. Cuba's recent market opening reflects lessons learned from Soviet collapse. The shopping experience, seemingly mundane, revealed fundamental truths about economic organization and political legitimacy. The history of Soviet shopping encompasses far more than commercial transactions. It reveals how ideological commitments shaped daily existence, how systemic constraints generated adaptive behaviors, and ultimately, how the accumulation of small daily frustrations undermined an entire political system. The queues, the shortages, the informal networks, these were not incidental features, but essential characteristics of the command economy. If you found this examination of Soviet retail history valuable, please consider supporting this channel through the like button, subscription, and notification bell. As with all historical subjects, the Soviet shopping experience defies simple moral judgments. The system achieved certain objectives: guaranteed employment, price stability for basics, elimination of absolute poverty. Yet it failed to provide the consumer satisfaction that citizens increasingly expected. History, as always, reveals itself in shades of gray rather than absolute black and white. The Soviet shopping system story reminds us that economic organization profoundly shapes human experience, and that systems neglecting consumer welfare do so at their ultimate peril.